This is one last paper about sexist oppression, and it gives an example of how someone trained in Greek philosophy, in holistic thinking, in understanding the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, would be able to articulate the nature of oppression by looking at it as parts of a whole. Sexist oppression, a developmental description. For the purposes of this paper, a feminist will be defined as anyone who agrees with both of the following propositions. First, it is more difficult for women to get what societies have to offer, such as education, money, status, and power, and two, there's something unjust about this fact. These propositions are neither innocuous nor obvious. It's possible to disagree with the first. Critics of affirmative action, for example, might use statistics to try and prove that this claim is false. On the other hand, it's possible to agree with the first and disagree with the second. There are those who believe that a woman's most fundamental task is to be a mother and her natural place is in the home, caring for her children. It is possible to believe that it ought to be more difficult for women to get higher education, money, status, and power, because raising the barriers to such rewards would encourage women to make a stable family life their primary and more attainable goal. Certainly, having a stable family life is an important goal in life. Power, money, and status are not the only or even necessarily the most important human values. The point in this paper is simply that patriarchal attitudes and institutions have systematically, consciously and unconsciously, deprived women of making the most appropriate choices about how to live their lives. They have deprived women of access to the social goods women justly deserve. Assuming then that it is unjust for women to have greater difficulties when trying to lay claim to social goods, let us turn to the first proposition. It is more difficult for women to get those goods. The rest of this paper will set out in broad outline to argue that it is in fact true. Much feminist literature over the last 30 to 40 years has been focused on demonstrating exactly this point. The goal here is to set out the best conceptual frameworks through which we can ask the right questions, conduct the right studies, and come to the broadest and most fruitful understanding of the nature of sexist oppression. The first and perhaps most important principle to use as a foundation is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The oppression of women is one so-called synergistic effect of a patriarchal society. Women have often been their own worst enemies when it comes to gaining access to higher education, money, power, and status. Women often, in fact, choose not to study science, math, and philosophy, the disciplines which open doors to more high-status careers. A woman may ostensibly choose not to work the number of hours, not to put down the colleague against whom she's supposed to be competing, or not to engage in any number of other behaviors which lead to promotion in a competitive and adversarial milieu. The focus of an adequate discussion of sexist oppression should not be on the specific choices made after age 20, but must begin with the kind of conditioning which led to those choices long before they were actually made. How did the deck get stacked in the first place? In her book, The Politics of Reality, Marilyn Frye gives an excellent description of the nature of synergistic effects. Quote, "The experience of oppressed people is that the living of one's life is confined and shaped by forces and barriers which are not accidental or occasional and hence avoidable, but are systematically related to each other. Consider a bird cage. If you look very closely at just one wire in the cage, you cannot see the other wires. If your conception of what is before you is determined by this myopic focus, you could look at that one wire up and down the length of it and be unable to see why a bird would not just fly around the wire any time it wanted to go somewhere. Furthermore, even if, one day at a time, you myopically inspected each wire, you still could not see why a bird would have trouble going past the wires to get anywhere. There's no physical property of any one wire, nothing that the closest scrutiny could discover that will reveal how a bird could be inhibited or harmed by it, except in the most accidental way. It is only when you step back, stop looking at the wires one by one microscopically, and take a macroscopic view of the whole cage that it will require no great subtlety of mental powers. It's perfectly obvious that the bird is surrounded by a network of systematically related barriers, no one of which would be the least hindrance to its flight, but which, by their relations to each other, are as confining as the solid walls of a dungeon. It is now possible to grasp one of the reasons why oppression can be hard to see and recognize. One can study the elements of an oppressive structure with great care and some goodwill without seeing the structure as a whole. This is what I say is the Greek paideia educational system tries to get you to think about the broader patterns, the whole, and then the parts in relation to the whole. In order to understand sexist oppression, therefore, it's necessary to see each aspect of patriarchy and how it fits into a larger whole. One of the most comprehensive approaches to sexism is taken by Allison Jagger in her book, Feminist Politics and Human Nature. Jagger uses and modifies the Marxist concept of alienated labor to articulate the many, many ways women become alienated from themselves and each other, and are rendered unable to focus their energies to the degree necessary to compete for social goods. Long before higher education, money, status, and power become options, women have been sufficiently internally divided and externally marginalized to make it extremely difficult for them to have the opportunity and desire to take on a demanding but rewarding career. In what follows, Jagger's concept of alienation will be modified and expanded to include references to the works of many other feminists whose discussion of sexism will be included under the notion of alienation. First, I just want to point out Aristotle is not a Marxist. It's not about the particular recommendations they come to about whether the economic system should be government run. It's not like that. It's the method of thinking, the holistic thinking, that I'm seeing is analogous. First, however, a brief note on the notion of alienation. Marx believed that in a capitalist society, and any society based on economic oppression, the kind of work one does to survive is alienated work, because workers pour their humanity into their products, while the factory owner then takes the product and makes a profit on it. Marx says, quote, "The object which labor produces, labor's product, confronts it as something alien, as a power independent of the producer. But the estrangement is manifested not only in the result, but in the act of production, within the producing activity itself." Unquote. Further, says Marx, in a society based on economic exploitation, all human activity is dehumanizing. Quote, "The worker no longer feels himself to be freely active in any but his animal functions, and in his animal functions he no longer feels himself to be anything but an animal. What is animal becomes human, and what is human becomes animal. Certainly, eating, drinking, procreating, etc., are also genuinely human functions, but in the abstraction which separates them from the sphere of all other human activity and turns them into sole and ultimate ends, they are animal. The other point I want to make is that the capabilities approach includes this kind of conceptualization. For example, you have the capability of using your senses, your imagination, and your thought in a way that's human, that's over and above mere animal desires. It's very Marxist. I mean, they adapted some of the ideas in Marx. Marx believed that what is important is not the human activity itself, but the social and economic context within which that activity takes place. In a communist society, according to Marx, workers will still eat, drink, procreate, and work, but their activity will not be alienated because no one will be using that activity to gain unjust wealth and power over the workers. By analogy, women's activities in patriarchy are alienated because women's activities, their eating, procreating, and working, are all used by men to maintain male domination. Women are rewarded when they please men and punished when they do not, just as workers in an exploitative system are forced to work to please owners and are punished if they fail. But there are limitations to this analogy. In one sense, Marx did not go far enough. Marx emphasized only economic relations because he believed that when economic relations based on exploitation and alienation end, all other kinds of exploitation and alienation will also end. Unfortunately, as Jagger points out, the exploitation of women goes much deeper than their economic dependence on men. Psychological development begins sooner and leads to more self-selected oppression than economic relations alone can explain. Furthermore, Marx believed the end of economic exploitation would lead to the end of all exploitation, but this is too utopian. Even if patriarchy would end, there would be many other human evils and problems. Racism, xenophobia, homophobia, and other non-economically based ways of oppressing different groups would still survive. The oppression would simply take another form. Also, there are many other human vices, such as greed, envy, excess anger, and pride, which would not end with the end of patriarchy. All that would end, if patriarchy would ever end, would be the way these weaknesses are currently used to reinforce male domination. The end of patriarchy would not necessarily entail the end of marriage or families. Human beings would engage in many of the same activities as they do now. If patriarchy were to end, women would still want to eat, procreate, and work. They simply would not be alienated in these activities, meaning they would not be doing them to please a man, motivated either by internalized self-hatred or a carefully calculated survival strategy. Given all of these qualifications, let us examine briefly what it means to say women's activities under patriarchy are alienated. First, women are alienated from their own bodies. Women in modern American society, and now all over the world, are bombarded with the message that being physically attractive to men should be a high priority in their lives. There's evidence to show that the message has had a profound effect. Women, in fact, are alienated from their own bodies. Women's fashions, cosmetics, manicures, hair care, liposuction, plastic surgery, diet products, breast implants are only a few huge industries that are directly or indirectly related to a cultural obsession with appearances, an obsession which is a preoccupation for women more than men. Growing cases of anorexia and bulimia are two examples of when this obsession is taken to a dangerous extreme. Adolescence is the crisis time because it's the point in the life cycle when physical appearance and sexual awareness converge. The concern for how one appears physically turns into an awareness of sexual attraction and attractiveness. Women are further alienated from their own bodies, and the stakes get higher. Many books, including Reviving Ophelia, Saving the Selves of Adolescent Girls by Mary Pfeiffer, discuss the way adolescent girls are alienated from their bodies. They see themselves as the male gaze would see them and lose their own sense of identity and power to someone else. Further, for many women even today, economic well-being depends on their ability to attract a male who is able and willing to play the role of provider. If employment is defined as doing what one has to do to earn money, then a woman's full-time employment has been, and still often is, or her most important employment, to catch a man who's going to be a breadwinner for her. There's too much evidence that a female in her teens, even today, would be better off tying her destiny to a wealthy or soon-to-be wealthy male and keep his interest for the rest of his life than for her to try and seek her own fortune and success in life. So if material success alone is the standard, then a woman better fix up her body to be attractive to a man. If a young woman tries to make her own way, there are social pressures that undermine that choice. Adolescent boys are not socialized to be sexually attracted to a female peer who's competitive, intelligent, hardworking, and serious about having a successful and difficult career. I hope this is changing, but it's hard to tell. Too many adolescent girls experience alienation from their bodies when their efforts to work towards such a goal lead to social rejection. They are socialized away from developing both their minds and their bodies. Certainly this is changing, but the current long-term economic trajectories of women's lives lead to the fact that the reward system is still in place to encourage women to succeed vicariously through their husband's success. Conditioning women to be obsessed with physical attractiveness does not only hinder a woman's ambition, it also makes her more susceptible to sexual violence. Females of all ages are subject to sexual violence far more than males. Being the victim of such violence in turn affects self-confidence and ambition to succeed in what becomes perceived as a dangerous world. In the United States alone, there are over 90,000 reported adult rapes annually, and rape is an unreported crime. One of the reasons it's unreported is because the question, what is rape, is controversial, especially if the forced sexual penetration occurs between people who know each other, are living together, or are married. Often women will not report rape in these contexts. In a survey of American sexual behavior by Robert T. Michael, which is summarized in the book Sex in America, Michael found that, quote, 22% of women were forced sexually at some time after age 13, and only 0.6% were forced by another woman. Only 2% of men were forced. All but 4% of these women knew the man who was forcing them. Nearly half said they were in love with him. Furthermore, the survey found a substantial positive correlation between the experience of force and a general unhappiness in life. Men, by contrast, overwhelmingly denied using force. Only 3% said they forced a woman, and 0.2% said they forced a man, unquote. Married women especially refused to report spousal abuse and rape because of the social pressure to keep up appearances, the likelihood that such an accusation would end the marriage, and the emotional and economic dependence of many women on their husbands. Acquaintance rape, including rape within marriage, therefore, is another way that women are alienated from their own bodies in two respects. First, women are alienated from their own bodies in a way that has a serious negative effect on their emotions, their attitude toward life. Next, women are alienated from men because men do not believe they are forcing women to have sex. This is an intellectual dimension of the experience, the problem of interpreting what is going on. Women, then, are alienated from both their emotional responses to the experience as well as their own intellectual interpretations of the meaning of the experience. The connection between sexual violence and pornography is a controversial one. Feminists, as defined in this paper, disagree on the question of whether pornography should be legal. Some believe pornography should be illegal because it creates a climate of intimidation and sexist oppression throughout the society. Others believe we should avoid the heavy hand of the law and focus instead on education and prevention as the best solutions. Women on both sides of the debate recognize the fact that women struggle for social goods more than men, that this is unjust, and that pornography is one symptom of a larger social disease. Like so many other controversial social and political issues, this is a question about which reasonable people disagree. Unfortunately, on this particular issue, not only do well-intentioned feminists disagree, they can become alienated from each other over these disagreements. In other words, not only do they experience the alienation personally and emotionally, and not only do they experience alienation from their own intellectual interpretation of their experience when it conflicts seriously with that of their sexual partner, but they experience alienation from other feminists in their interpretation of how to develop strategies to overcome this aspect of oppression. Another aspect of female sexual alienation is the decision about whether, when, and why to become sexually active. The issue of forced sex or date rape is related to this decision. There's a long-standing tradition in many cultures of what is called the male double standard. Young men do not want to be virgins at marriage, but they want to marry a virgin. Such a standard leads inevitably to young women who feel coerced into sex because they want both to please the guy they're with and also to remain virgins for their future husbands. A young woman may be labeled frigid if she rejects sexual advances and promiscuous if she does not reject them. As long as men have a double standard, women will be alienated from decisions about whether to become sexually active before marriage. Even a young woman who is willing to take responsibility for her own decisions and does not blame men for sending conflicted signals will be labeled as either frigid or promiscuous by a young man who thinks of women in terms of the double standard. Once the decision to become sexually active is made, whether or not to use birth control and what kind usually rests with the woman and is considered her responsibility. Birth control pills, IUDs, and diaphragms are under the female's control. Condoms require responsible behavior from both sexual partners. Although it would appear that this gives woman some power, since she can choose to take birth control pills, get an ID, use a diaphragm, or insist on a condom. If the birth control fails, who's responsible? Women tend to take responsibility for unexpected pregnancies. or get blamed for them. Women who get pregnant and are considering abortion feel extremely guilty, usually, about whatever decision they make. Women tend to take on more guilt and responsibility for such decisions because they are the sexual partner who is physically affected most. A woman will be labeled a murderer by some for having an abortion, and she'll be labeled extremely irresponsible by others for bringing a child into the world without providing an emotionally and economically stable environment. In other words, for not getting an abortion. These are certainly extremely serious issues. The question here is, who takes the responsibility? Who feels most alienated from body and soul when such events occur? Who gets blamed? Do women tend to take too much responsibility and their male partners too little? Evidence points in that direction. If a woman or a couple should choose to have a child, women are alienated from their own experiences as mothers. Under patriarchy, women have been forced to be the primary caregivers, which leads them to pour their need for meaning and their need for male approval and broader social approval on how the children turn out. Adrienne Rich, in her book Of Women Born, discusses the many dimensions of women's experiences of alienation in all of the activities related to pregnancy and child rearing. Until recently, obstetricians and gynecologists were men with no empathy for and no training or encouragement to have sympathy with their patients. Women's experiences at gynecologists' offices during pregnancy were often experiences of alienation. The act of giving birth is alienating if, on the one hand, a woman is unnecessarily drugged and not allowed to participate in the process, or, on the other hand, if she's ridiculed for requesting an anesthetic. At such a critical time, women have not been respected and trusted to make appropriate decisions about what is best. Decisions are made according to the preferences of paid professionals who until recently have been predominantly men. In her book, Gynecology, Mary Daly discusses a long history of ignorance and oppression among gynecologists. Even assuming a child is brought into an intact family by a couple who love each other and are committed to staying together and being responsible partners and parents, women are alienated in their experience of mothering. Professionals in child care are as often as not men who write books about child care, but who do not spend long hours taking care of children. Admonitions to act rationally and not get emotionally distraught are either unrealistic or incorrect. Those who condemn loss of emotional control have never been in the situations which lead to such a loss of control, and hence cannot write in a way which will actually communicate to those who need guidance. An excess emphasis on maintaining emotional control could lead caregivers to become too detached, and the children for whom they are responsible to fail to bond adequately with their primary caregiver. Since the professional's advice is so far removed from the primary caregiver's experience, the mother almost always, mothers are alienated from their own experiences. Further, since the professional's point of view is respected by society and the mother's is not, if a mother tries to articulate what's actually going on, if she tries to use her mind to reflect on her experiences in ways which might be helpful to other mothers, her interpretation of the experience is ridiculed as unprofessional. She's alienated from her interpretations of her life and from those aspects of her life which she has been forced to consider the most meaningful and fulfilling. Further, she's given full responsibility for ensuring that the children turn out well, which includes being socialized into a patriarchal culture. If there is any problem with the children's development, the mother is considered the most responsible. A woman is alienated from the activity of mothering because her children are considered a social product and she's judged according to how society judges them, not according to her own judgment. Her experiences and judgments are not trusted or respected. Her forced status as mother is considered second class, and she must socialize her children into accepting her inferior relationship vis-a-vis their father. Children gradually become conscious of being judged, of the fact that their mother is being held responsible for their behavior, and of their mother's inferior status compared to their father. They, in turn, can become alienated from their mothers because they can blame them for their own actions rather than either themselves or their fathers. They can blame their mothers when their lives don't follow their own expectations, realistic or not. Dorothy Dinnerstein, in her book The Mermaid and the Minotaur, argues that a mother's monopoly on child-rearing leads women to get blamed for the frailties and vulnerabilities which are simply built into the human condition. Now that many women with young children work outside of the home, some of the responsibilities for child development and differences in status between the two parents are more evenly balanced. But women tend to be given or to take upon themselves a disproportionate responsibility for child rearing, whether or not they work outside of their homes. Again, women are torn. Again, they're alienated. If a woman does not work outside of the home, her work at home is not adequately respected, and her responsibility for the children is even greater and naturally becomes a matter of constant concern. Women are judged negatively by some and positively by others when they choose to work or not to work. Whatever choices they make trigger judgments because women have been conditioned from a young age to be concerned about how they make other people feel and about what other people think about them. Men are judged negatively if they do not work, but very few able-bodied men do not work. Women are judged negatively by someone for whatever decisions they make. A woman's decision to work or not work, to present herself to the public as a working mother or not a working mother, brings with it a degree of self-consciousness and alienation, a feeling of being out of touch with one's own choices, which is not the case for men. If they decide to work, women must decide what kind of care their children should get. Again, women make the vast majority of these decisions. High-quality child care is expensive. Women who go to work because of financial need, whose husbands make less money, have difficult decisions to make about how many hours to work and what kind and quality of daycare is available at discount prices. Women whose husbands make more money might be able to choose whether or not to work outside of the home, but they are judged for and therefore alienated from their decisions. Women who do not work for the money, but for the satisfaction which comes from being respected as a professional, are more likely than men to be judged negatively for seeking satisfaction outside of the home. Women who decide they have a talent and seek higher education to cultivate that talent are more torn and alienated than men when they work to develop a high level of professional expertise. Beginning in high school and the classes that are most closely associated with achievement later on, such as math and science, teachers tend to favor young men. This trend continues in college and is more severe in upper-level classes related to future careers, and graduate school. Women are alienated from their own desire to succeed because they are judged negatively more often than men when they make that desire public and choose to get the attention of teachers and other authority figures who can move them forward professionally. In the process of going to school or establishing a career, women have been working a second shift. Women have tried to do the lion's share of the housework and childcare while also pursuing careers and higher education. The result has been exhaustion and alienation. Women might turn down offers of demanding careers because the unwritten and unspoken and even unacknowledged demands at home seem to be too great. If a divorce occurs, women tend to take more responsibility and to be more affected, both emotionally and financially. Under such circumstances, women will accept less challenging jobs in order to keep focused on the family. Women might choose career over family and not marry or not have children, only to arrive at middle age without having broken through the glass ceiling, without being offered the job appropriate to their ability and career history. If a woman wants to take out a substantial loan to start a business, she's discriminated against and less likely to be able to get one with the same, even though she has the same assets vis-a-vis the size of the loan as a man. If a woman is politically ambitious and wants to run a nationwide expensive political campaign, she's less likely to have the connections and financial resources that are available to men, even if she has the talent and drive to rule. The entire educational system can be shown to have a bias in favor of the kind of thinking and reward system which is either biologically or culturally gendered in favor of the way men think and behave, or have been conditioned to think and behave. There's a great disagreement about whether men are biologically structured to separate thinking from emotions and sex from love, or whether this is only cultural. Certainly, such a separation focuses a person on creating power and wealth rather than on developing interpersonal relationships. My point is simply that the educational system, the first step toward the other social goods, is unnecessarily and inappropriately gendered. This leads women to be alienated from their own intellectual interests, abilities, and lives. The disciplines which are to some extent emotionally detached, in the sense that emotions are not discussed as part of the discipline, such as the sciences and mathematics, are given the most respect in our society. The disciplines which include the study of human emotion, such as psychology, sociology, and literature, do not in themselves lead to higher status careers. Institutions of higher education have compartmentalized learning in a way which allows students to believe that they will be able to get and keep jobs based strictly on detached intellectual talents without having to understand the social, psychological, and historical context within which these activities occur and will occur in their lives. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that a human being needs emotional as well as professional maturity in order to get a job and keep it. The academy compartmentalizes learning in a way which reinforces narrow-minded, self-interested, and competitive behavior. The educational system, particularly higher education, the level of education necessary to join a profession and have some influence on the attitudes and institutions of a society, has been and continues to be steeped in the patriarchal habits and assumptions of the past. This is most evident in a discipline such as philosophy, where there's no need to choose the detached observer model of reading, writing, teaching, and learning over a more balanced model which includes emotion, action, and interpersonal dialogue. Yet the area of philosophy of science is given more professional respect than philosophy of art. but there's nothing inherent in philosophy itself which would favor such an imbalance. The philosophical questions which philosophers of art wrestle with are just as philosophical as the questions related to philosophy of science. Philosophy of art focuses on the relationship between art and emotions. A class in philosophy of art should require a student to reflect upon issues such as whether some art is better or worse because of the emotions which motivated it, or because of the emotions it engenders in others. Students should expand their emotional experiences through exposure to art, and they should reflect on such experiences. But courses in philosophy of art are rare. Even among such courses, a professionally respectable professor could spend every class period doing a strict, unemotional analysis of a concept related to philosophy of art and of differing concepts among feuding philosophers of art without ever requiring that either the teacher or the students have an authentic emotional aesthetic experience and then reflect upon the experience. Further, a professionally respected and regularly published philosopher of art might set his life goal at arguing that there are no better or worse emotions and no good or bad art. Or he might spend his time analyzing arguments about art without ever having an aesthetic experience. This is a traditionally gendered approach to philosophy of art in particular and to education in general. Further, if philosophy, the discipline which asks all of the so-called big questions of life, is biased toward detached, specialized intellectualizing, then the educational system as a whole is producing warped human beings who overdevelop their abilities to analyze, examine, investigate, and critique, but who are underdeveloped in their abilities to reflect on emotions and actions, to empathize with others, to understand human experience from someone else's point of view. In the past, women have been alienated from their own intellectual capacities because they have been alienated by their experiences of higher education. This is not because women are necessarily by nature more emotional than men, but only because women have been told that they are more emotional than men and have been asked to engage in those activities which require sophisticated emotional responses, such as child raising or entertaining, when they discover that the institutions of higher education are set up to ignore emotions and the ability to understand other people, they're alienated from their experience of higher education. Women need to have the opportunity to question the life of the mind, the way the life of the mind has been understood and reinforced by men, and women should be able to set up their own models along with a justification for why one model is better than another. If the academy keeps enforcing detached and one-sided ways of learning, writing, and reading, it is no wonder that our society produces doctors who have an insufficient understanding or interest in the emotional factors involved in human illness and are instead motivated by greed, or politicians and executives who do not sufficiently understand the emotional factors involved in leadership and focus on greed and competitive and adversarial relationships. The bias in the profession of philosophy is only one symptom of a bias throughout the educational system, a bias that alienates women from their ideas and alienates intellectuals from the rest of society unnecessarily. There are a number of claims made in this paper which have not been completely documented or proven. In some cases, studies are available, but it is difficult to find them. In other cases, there never will be studies done to support sufficiently the overall claim. The claim of this paper is more conceptual than empirical, although empirical studies have been done to support many of the points made here. My point is that oppression is systematic, like a birdcage. It is unconscious more than conscious, and it is institutionalized more than chosen. It has a synergistic effect on women, an effect that leads women to choose family over education, money, power, and status. Trying to establish the fact and nature of sexist oppression through empirical research leads to many problems. First, it's difficult to establish cause-effect connections in human affairs with the same degree of certainty that one can establish such connections in relationship to the natural world. For example, no one will be able to link pornography to rape in a scientifically verifiable way. Yet pornography is a symptom of sexist oppression. It is the effect of an oppressive attitude toward women, and it feeds and increases that attitude. Second, many aspects of sexist oppression are not conscious and deliberate, so they will not show up in surveys where people are asked to give their conscious opinions. Third, the many aspects of sexist oppression are related to each other synergistically, meaning they reinforce each other in ways which cannot be measured, or measured very accurately, through empirical studies. This brings us back to Marilyn Frye's analogy with the birdcage. One cannot establish a direct, scientifically verifiable cause-effect connection between any of the wires in the birdcage. Like the wires of the birdcage, the various aspects of patriarchy are not directly connected to each other. Although, in some sense they are, the birdcage is. It is only indirectly in the way the cage is constructed and the amount of space between the wires relative to the size of the bird that makes it impossible for the bird to escape. The complex, multidimensional aspects of male domination are intricately connected because societies are naturally complex and complicated and woven together in multiple ways. A woman who rejects the comfort of a traditional life for the sake of a more challenging life will run into all of the conscious and unconscious barriers built into a society which assumes that women will choose marriage and family over a challenging career. This paper is an appeal to Socrates' admonitions, know thyself, and an unexamined life is not worth living. It is an appeal to intuition guided by reasoned argument and empirical data. Every educated person at this time in history should be sufficiently self-consciously aware to know that most, if not all, societies today are patriarchal. Every educated person should recognize that, in the final analysis, patriarchy is unnatural and deprives everyone of a satisfying life. One does not need to argue about the legitimacy of empirical studies or women's ambiguities about taking on challenging careers in order to recognize the existence and harm patriarchy entails. Educated people simply need to live examined lives and recognize how much of their own concept of themselves depends on the oppression of others. They should reflect deeply on how to change that situation. Becoming less sexist is not a matter of merely changing laws or rules. It involves, in addition, a transformation of all aspects of life and consciousness, beginning with changing one's mind, one's worldview. Men need to examine themselves in order to understand the ways their assumptions about life reinforce sexist oppression. A man who really holds a double standard in regard to sexual activity, that is, who wants to engage in premarital sex, but wants his wife to be a virgin, needs to know that he's causing women to be divided against themselves in their own decisions about sexual activity. He's labeling them sexually frigid if they reject him, and sexually promiscuous if they do not reject him, or if he refuses to marry them because of their lack of virginity. He set them up for alienation from their sexuality. A man who wants his wife to contribute financially to the family, but does not want to do housework, is setting her up for failure. She cannot do both well. A man who wants his wife to be sexually attractive and also wants her to be a great caregiver, but who does not think changing diapers is particularly sexy, is setting her up for failure. He has divided her against herself. A man who wants his wife to be smart and yet is not sexually attracted to smart women is setting her up for failure. A man who wants to be smarter, more successful, and to dominate over his wife, and yet resents her dependence on him, is not only divided in his own mind, but is also offering her a deeply conflicted way of life. A man who wants to run the world and wants a wife who is his equal, but does not want to compete with her or any other women for the privilege of running the world, has set women up for failure. Men who rank women according to sexual attractiveness and then wonder why women are so preoccupied with their looks and why they say such nasty things about each other has to become aware that it is he who created the problem in the first place. In general, a man who alienates a woman from herself, from her children, from other women, and from the desire for education and power, and then who turns around and accuses her of complaining because she's victimized, is a classic guy who doesn't get it. Alienation is not victimization. Alienation is a systematic detachment of women from themselves. Alienation places the cause on those with power. Victimization implies the victim has choices and chooses not to exercise them due to lack of strong character. Criticizing women for playing the role of victim is, once again, making them responsible for more than they are responsible for. As has been shown, this is nothing new. Certainly women must become conscious of the many ways they accept and depend on their second-class status in a patriarchy. A more egalitarian way of life will not necessarily be easier. The claim here is simply that it will be more just. Self-knowledge in a patriarchal system requires a grasp of the whole and an ability to see any single issue within the context of that whole. Educated people today, male and female, have greater opportunity than ever before to recognize the multidimensional nature of patriarchy and to change themselves and the society so it will become less male-dominated. We owe it to Socrates, who, after all, was taught by his mother and by Diotima to try and live more examined lives in respect to patriarchy.